And without further ado, I would love to welcome Professor Hani Bawardi, Dr. Hani Bawardi. He's a professor in history and principal faculty in Arab American Studies at University of Michigan Dearborn. Um, and he has presented in national and international conferences. And his book, The Making of Arab Americans, changed the way most scholars look at Arab American history. And he also owns, and I can attest to that, a very extensive manuscript collection that is very wonderful. And I know he brings a very, very, very interesting perspective on both the pen bond and the Arab history in general. So, without further ado, Doctor, thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
My pleasure. Thank you, Zainab. I hope to live up to your expectations and this very kind introduction. I have a lot to share with you, to be honest with you, and I struggled as to where to start, because the more we think we know about members of AlRabitah AlQalamiyah, its significance, its history, and its place in history, as frankly, is the less we know. And there are reasons for that. So I'd like to propose today to sort of talk about what is the significance of AlRabitah. AlRabitah AlQalamiyah means the pen bond, sometimes referred to as the pen league. That's not the right word. And the pen bond is slowly making its way into, the discourses, which is good. Those who speak Arabic or are familiar with the heritage that came out of New York, New Jersey, seem sure of the answer, who they are and their significance. But most people either never heard of the title or are content with the impressions they have of Gibran. Gibran Khalil Gibran is his name in Arabic. And forgive me if I don't anglicize the names here. He is the author of The Prophet in the English language. But who were AlRabitah members, and what accounts for their staggering importance in the Arab world? Gibran's life, writings, and intellectual capacity was certainly enhanced by his association with Amina Rehani, co-founder of AlRabitah, originally in 1916, in fact, who was born in 1876 in Frike, in the Lebanon area of Syria. Likely with the association of Nasib Arida at the time, another author, member of this group. AlRabitah was reformed in 1920. That was actually the official start of the this collection of authors, society of authors, headed by Gibran this time in 1920, and with the membership of Rashid Ayyub, Wadi' Bahout, William Katsiflis, of Greek origins, whose family immigrated to the area, we think 300 years ago, prior, Abdul Masih Haddad and Nadra Haddad, and also the indefatigable Ali Abu Madi and Mikhail Naimi, who wrote about Gibran extensively. So what's so special about these authors? Linguistically speaking, or from a purely literary point of view, that's the easy part. They share a gift of uncanny command of the Arabic letter, steeped in classical training, and they also possess the drive to innovate styles that would make Arabic language accessible to the masses. So their method was maintaining a balance of classical and more contemporary expressions and vocabulary, and writing about immediate surroundings and concerns, not in lofty grand style that characterized Arab literature for an extended period during that time, meaning from the late Ottoman period through the start of the 19th century. So they wanted a way out of that. They wanted the people to get in touch with their history and their lives and write in Arabic about more immediate concerns. But what paved the way for their importance is the historical moment, their place in the historical moment, and convergence of several factors that are social, but also political. It's a complex topic. So at least I'd like to give you an idea about what constitutes the foundation for their importance, because they have a common theme, common thread that runs through them, which made them very, very important. And their importance actually is enduring in the Arab world. Just to be sure, I mean, I don't talk about them in abstract at all. I grew up on the poetry of Ali Abu Madi and all those poets, and knew their names as a child, all the way in the Near East. These authors, although unique, eloquent, and possessing of superior command of the language, also thought of themselves as reformers, feminists, before that term became salient in its contemporary context, progressive on matters of religion and human endeavors. But what did they seek reform of? What did they seek to reform if they were reformers? In fact, how much do we really know about Gibran, other than he is the author of one of the best-selling books in history, The Prophet, which was also translated into over 30 languages? Who are the others? Are they as significant as Gibran? To whom did they write? All these questions are seldom discussed in the English language. The literature on them is considerable in the Arabic language. However, those guys wrote from New York and New Jersey, and their place in Arab American history is people kind of have deference for that, but they don't understand it. So how did they shape our identity in this country? And they did, by the way. That's one of the major points I'd like to make. What is their place in Arab American saga overall? I'd like to start our conversation by exploring some of these topics. Specifically, I'd like to share with you a sketch of historical, literary, and to some extent political trends that yielded these important authors. The space I propose to talk about, briefly albeit, took place amid expanded European ambitions, ease of travel, and momentous events that reshaped the Near East, especially the Levant and Egypt. This isn't an exhaustive outline by any means, but my aim here is to explain the very impetus for their outlook and a major source of their inspiration. If I have to find a word that encapsulates these aspirations, it would be Syria. Not today's Syria, rather natural Syria or geographic Syria. Those folks came, many of them from parts of Syria proper, but also the Mount Lebanon area. The source of these aspirations began decades before our authors were even born. Yet they likely would have been different if they existed at all without these aspirations and historical background I propose to explain. So let me start with a few examples. So like if you go to the Arab American or the English language news in this country, you find an article about a visit by a fellow named Salim Sarkis, who was running for his life from the Sultan Abdul Hamid, the Ottoman Sultan, because he is fighting for autonomy from the Turks and ultimately independence. He came to New York in 1899, before any of our authors were even famous. So there's an article, maybe my colleague Wissam can find an article about Sarkis's visit. There we go. I wonder if we can make that a little bit larger, the font. But in any case, that's an example of, some of the issues that were salient at the time. The Syrians' insistence that they are distinct people who would like to be independent or more independent or autonomous from Turkish suzerainty. The man came from Egypt. There's a reason for that. Egypt was occupied by the British since 1882. Ironically, the British kept Abdul Hamid's spies and police at bay, while a lot of the Syrian migrants to Egypt found the freeway, the leeway to establish some of the most important publications in the Arab world, in Arab literary history. So in Egypt, you have Syrians who founded Al-Ahram, by the Thaqla brothers in 1875. In Egypt also, Al-Mushir was established by the Sarkis family, not to mention Georgi Zaidan, an Orthodox Christian considered one of the fathers of modern Arab national identity. Also lived in the refuge or the safety of Egypt, away from Abdul Hamid's reach, where he published Al-Hilal, and he wrote seminal books like Tarikh Hikayat al-Islam, or History of Islamic Tales. It was on the pages of these publications that, in addition to Al-Muqtataf, edited by Yaqub Sarrouf, another important figure, also Syrian, that Arab leadership, or the Arab readership rather, were introduced to Gibran, Rihani, and their friends. Rihaniyat were published in Egypt, as a matter of fact. And Rihani cut his teeth on translating Rubaiyat al-Khayyam, the quatrains of Abu al-Ala, into English from the Arabic. And he went on to write the first novel in English, Arab-American novel in English, the Book of Khalid. But we have basic questions to contend with here. So where did these authors achieve their education? That is, how and when did their philosophies on so many things emanate from? Of course, I don't mean to simplify things too much, as each was fiercely independent in their own way and commanded respect. The picture you see here is one of those, not one of our authors, but a very accomplished author who also served in the American-Spanish War, 1899, 1898, 1899, a proud soldier. And he looks like one of the, the Rough Riders there, very, very proud. And this picture came from a book called The Syrian Soldier in Three Wars. And in it, you can see the pictures of most of our authors. If my dear friend Wissam can pan on the other pictures of the authors, Nadra Haddad, Ali Abu Madi, and the rest of them. And The Three Wars, the book was published in 1919. This is not, yeah, here we go. That's the title of the book right there a minute ago. The book was published in 1919, and the three wars the Syrians fought in, according to the author at least, is the Spanish-American War, the war in the Philippines, and World War I. And Syrian immigrants fought, joined the war effort and bought and sold more war bonds than any immigrant group per capita. That has to do with their, preference for fighting the Turks in that war, winning their right to go back to Syria as an independent country. This is a rare book that is in my possession, compliment of my dear friends, the Dalak family. The story ultimately begins with narratives, a language, the Arabic language, that in turn serves to cement common customs, traditions, and fosters collective memory of the past. Arabic is the bedrock of who we are, regardless of distance, time, religion, sect, nationality. Of late, we became members of many nationalities as of the 20th century, thanks to colonialism. Color, if that even exists outside the Arabic language, and it does, perceived race or ethnicity. So, being an Arab is to belong to a cultural identity that transcends all these things, and the Arabic language has the capacity to express that. So a good place to start would be with Nasif al-Yazigi, born in 1800. He's an author of many books during the Ottoman Empire. He's the father of Ibrahim al-Yazigi, was one of the leading figures of the Nahda movement. So here you go, a trigger word, a word that explains what motivated, what drove our authors, Nahda. Nahda in Arabic is a word which means awakening, to awaken, or to get up from a slumber. So if you're sitting up, for example, you stand up. That's a different word. Yaqum is the word. Nahda signifies getting up from a very relaxed position, or from a slumber, from sleep. So, and the idea was that, during the Ottoman rule, long Ottoman rule, some almost 500 years. It was like akin to a deep nap, although the Ottomans sort of preserved the area from, Western ambitions. But their decline was painful for the Arab population and prolonged and marked by decay and inefficiency and backwardness. So Nasif al-Yazigi is another figure in that he basically wrote on his own terms, began to conceive of himself as a member of this Arab space. Greek Catholic, and many of those guys came in contact with American, less so English, but also Franciscan priests who were there to proselytize. For example, one of those was Eli Smith, and they're the ones who established the Syrian Protestant College, which later became in 1920 was renamed the American University of Beirut, one of the finer, learning institutions in the Arab world, which I wish them all the best during these difficult times right now. So he moved to Beirut in 1840, and he came in contact with these missionaries who wanted so bad to proselytize and translate the Bible into Arabic. Okay, proselytizing went only so far because most of the population were Muslims, although in the West they convinced themselves that, hey, there's like a lot of Christians that we have to sort of take care of. And for the French, that was one of their ways of establishing foothold in the area. And the result, as you know, is confessional politics. And what came after that is French and British colonialism. But their impetus, their excuse initially was to spread the word of the Bible. So it didn't work, of course. The population were not about to convert. They already believed in God and Jesus and all the prophets, and it didn't work. But what happened is that they brought printing presses, beginning with the French in Egypt, with the Napoleonic campaign in the Bulaq section of Cairo. But the Americans spearheaded that movement in the Levant, in parts of Lebanon and modern-day Lebanon and Syria. And those printing presses gave a chance for al-Bustani and al-Yazigi, Boutros al-Bustani, for example, and also Mikhail Mishaqqa, to establish what is called the Syrian Association for the Sciences and the Arts. It didn't last a very long time, but it was a very, very important stepping stone into what became known as the Syrian Scientific Association. That association was very nationalistic in nature and sought to gain independence from the Ottomans altogether. So this became a very important part of Al-Nahda. And the leaders of this movement were themselves authors, men of letters, and women also we know less about, who basically launched a new tradition of rehabilitating the Arabic language, writing in accessible style. And our authors learned in those schools. So when they came to the States, even as children, they possessed a command of the Arabic language. And Rihani is unique in that he taught himself later on. He came as a child, I think in 1888 or so. He was born in 1876, a little bit older than Gibran, who was born in 1883, I believe. So Rihani came in 1888, learned Arabic from scratch, and became a potent author. One can talk a lot about these personalities. Boutros al-Bustani, born in 1819, also is a major Nahda figure. He is considered to be one of the first Syrian nationalists because he built on his father's work by basically, sharpening this message of being an Arab in the Levant and a member of a Syrian nation. So ultimately, they saw themselves as Arab, part of the Arab world, but their immediate goals were to establish, tell their stories on their own terms as members of this distinct group of Arabs, part of the Arab world, and members of the Levant or Syrians. He edited Al-Jinan, which basically was a variety magazine. That's a very important thing. That was actually one of those first steps into talking about sciences and literature and all kinds of things that kind of drew people together into one readership. And he came in contact with American Protestant missionaries. Those guys were accomplished in the Arabic language, and the fruits of their labor, Boutros al-Bustani, working with this under the supervision of Van Dyke, and Eli Smith came up with the first Bible. Here's a copy of it. In 1866, this is the first Arabic language, not the first Arabic language Bible, but this is the first printing of the American Bible in the Arabic language, 1866. And the Bustanis went on to publish Muhit al-Muhit, or the circumference of the ocean, which is an Arabic to Arabic dictionary, very important one. And you would think, why would I need Arabic to Arabic dictionary? If you're a serious scholar, you do. It will be like your constant companion. And I happen to grab, this is the second part, or folder 2, right here. And it begins with the letter, let's see, appropriately, Dad. Our language is also known as Lughat al-Dad, or the language of Dad. The Arabic language is the only one in the world that has that letter, the Dad, in it. So, Ibrahim al-Yazigi, Boutros al-Bustani, Nasif al-Yazigi, his father, all those people kind of charted a path for our authors. They rehabilitated, or they configured the Arabic language to become everyday language, standard language, that is, not Ammiya. We have our own accents from village to village, from place to place, but we are united in speaking a standard Arabic. So the poetry they came up with was a appropriate mixture of classical and modern language. They wrote in rhymed verse, but also one of them, Amina Rihani, wrote in modern verse. That's not rhymed, that is. And they were influenced by the transcendentalists, American authors like Emerson, Hawthorne, and who wrote about nature extensively. So it was actually a matter of course that our authors would also write about nature and use that to kind of make the leap into social lessons of sorts. So one of those really famous poems was immortalized even further by Ferouz, who sang that poem, is A'tini an-nai wa ghanni, give me the nai or the flute and sing for me, by Gibran, which was, I think it was published first in Al-Mawakib, his book Al-Mawakib. And it has a heavy use of nature in order to deliver a very simple message, using like idioms like water, trees, and the forest. And the translations is very tricky, very personal, and it's an art, and it's very complex. So I chose one from the World Association of Arab Translators and Linguists. أعطني الناي وغني وانسى ظلم الأقوياء إنما الزنبق كأس للندى لا للدماء. He says, give the flute and sing to me, to forget the abuse of tyrants. The lily is a cup for dew, not for bloodshed. And they did this extensively. What else is unique about them? They also wrote about every part of Syria. They remembered Syria. They longed for Syria. Although they were in the United States, they acknowledged that, and they expressed their gratitude for the United States, which did not have any ambitions in the region yet, as of yet. In fact, around World War I, because the U.S. kind of threw its might behind, the Allies against the Turks, many people named their newborns Woodrow Wilson. For example, I interviewed one of those actually from the Scaff family. His name is Woodrow Wilson. So that gives you an idea. But what about Gibran? I mean, Gibran kind of disappears behind this mystical kind of shroud. He was an Arab and he was a nationalist like the rest of them. I can go on for a long time about the poetry of Ali Abu Mahdi and how important every part of Syria was for him. And when all was lost in Palestine, or nearly all was lost, he actually wrote extensively about Palestine, as did Amin al-Rihani long before him, even before Al-Nakba, which we celebrated only last week, or the catastrophe when 70% of Palestine was lost to the Zionist program. And Rihani went on to one of his books was actually titled Al-Nakabat, which means the catastrophes. And the real catastrophe, or the big one, happened almost 20 years after his book came out. Gibran himself was not a bystander. Ali Abu Mahdi may be best known about, his uncompromising poetry about Palestine and all, as he wrote about everything else. But Gibran himself had a message for the Syrians that is worthy of remembering. So in 1911, even before World War I, by 4 years, he addressed Al-Halaqat al-Dhahabiyya, or the Golden Circles, which is a literary society in New York. And he told them, among other things, you say, what then can the Syrian do if you rob him of his hope of reformed future in the land of his birth and childhood? Does he become a naturalized citizen of the country to which he immigrated? Or does he seek help from foreign countries, throwing his weakness at the mercy of European powers? He continues, the money earned by a peddler, a solitary peddler, is money earned by all Syrians. Every word a pupil learns in the American schools is a word learned by all Syrians. Free your children from the slavery of abhorrent old Bohemians, traditions, and old customs, and they will remain free, even in chains and jails. So this is what I meant by they were reformists. They wanted to reform Syria, make sure it's independent, and a place to go back to, and start a country of their own. That drove them. Did they belong in the United States? Yes, of course they did, and they acknowledged that. In fact, and I will end with this, I know I'm taking a little bit too much time here, but around World War I, there was like a lot of racist movements, like 100% Americanism, assimilation, like the Borg in Star Trek, forgetting who you are and conforming to an Anglo core. That was salient at the time. The one who challenged that first, before Horace Callan, before anyone else, was Amin al-Rihani. In a book called Letters to Uncle Sam, he basically addressed Uncle Sam, or the American government, and he said, I'm this downtrodden child of yours, like your stepson. Don't I belong here? And it was like a feeling analysis which basically captured the essence of cultural pluralism. The idea that you can be an Arab and yet can be a member of this country, or a citizen of this country, if you will. Cultural pluralism, what became known later as hyphenated Americans, but not until after World War II. So this is a good place to end. So I hope you can at least connect the authors when you hear their names to an Arab past. And you saw the pictures that Wissam was scrolling earlier. These were sketches by Gibran. When he sketched, he loved naked bodies, but he also sketched, our heroes of the past, Ibn Sina, Al-Muqaffa, Harun al-Rashid, all those Arab, Al-Mutanabbi. This is Al-Hussein al-Awwal, the King Hussein the First, king of the Hijaz, who fought the Turks in the Great Arab Revolt in 1916 and drove the Turks out of Syria. This is Ibn Sina, his rendition of Ibn Sina, known in the West as Abyssine. So they were connected to a deep, rich heritage, and they saw themselves culturally as part of this space where Arabism predates Islam, but that Islam subsumed the Arabs of the region, but they remained Arabs regardless of religions and sectarian affiliations. Thank you.
Dr. Bawardi, as usual, Anjad, like they say, la yumal, you are such a huge wealth of knowledge, like the all the knowledge you have, all the history, like the context, and of course all like the beautiful artifacts that I have seen firsthand, and the wonderful books that you have. Is such a wealth. And like just speaking to you, Anjad, like la yumal, as they say, it's so wonderful to always hear you talk about these things, because
I feel the same way speaking to you and to Michael, of course. Thank you.
Yes. So I'd like to remind everyone who's watching us that you can participate if you would like to ask Dr. Bawardi any question by leaving a comment, or also if you would like to participate in the open mic portion, you can see the link at the scroll. So while you guys assemble your questions for Dr. Bawardi, I wanted to ask you about the AlRabitah AlQalamiyah, or the pen bond, and the fact that it was in New York on that little, I believe, Washington Street, and it had such a huge influence in its time. So in Mujaz, how do you think this pen bond impacted the Arab American experience at that time, and how does it continue to impact it, or do you think it continues even in the first place to impact, and are there any traces of it left in the Arab American culture here?
Well, let me start with the last part first. I mean, preserving that, their effect or their traces in our identity is really up to us. We just have to keep them alive somehow. How did they influence our identity? They provided the bedrock for this identity, which is reforms, belonging to a geographical area in the modern context of the world, meaning a place that we can claim our own, we can unfold on our own terms, and self-rule, self-determination. They stood for all these things. So now let's talk about Arab Americans. So identity, by definition, you identify yourself in relation to the other, right? So what made us Arab Americans is that we had a yearning for the same things, against odds, against first the Ottoman yoke, later on against colonialism by the French and the British. And those members of AlRabitah AlQalamiyah sprung into action to raise aid during World War I, even before the end of World War I was even known, or which way it's going to go. They raised massive amounts of aid to help massive, widespread starvation in all parts of Syria because of the blockade the Allies struck against the Turks. So our people began to die of hunger. Some 30% of the entire population perished. So they sprung into action. When the Balfour Declaration became known, they too wrote about that, as did Elia Abu Madi expressly about and it wasn't just the people we mentioned here. It was like a network of their friends and allies and churches and mosques and all kinds of like countrymen across the board lined behind them and followed their example. They were no leaders of like political movement per se, but they provided the inspiration for many of those actions or early formal political organizations that sought the freedom for Syria. One of those was the Free Syria Society. In fact, one of its members was Mikhail Naimi and Nasib Arida, two of their members.
Right. Thank you for that answer. So we have a question, and it says, were the pen bond involved in the first Arab Congress in Paris in 1913?
I'm really like trying hard to establish or document whether Amin Rihani attended the first Arab conference in Paris. But I can tell you definitively almost that Nasib Arida, who received his education in Nazareth, by the way, who was a friend of a fellow named Amin Farah in Flint, Michigan, the founder of the Free Syria Society, were exposed to the ideas of Al-Arabi al-Fatat, or the Young Arab Society, an anti-Ottoman secret society active in Montpellier and Paris, with members all over the place. It was so secret and so effective that to this day, we don't know all their members, by the way. Many of them perished. The only person who gave us an idea about that is George Antonius in a book, and I'm glad this came to mind. It's called Yaqdat al-Arab in Arabic, or Arab Awakening. It was published in English, in fact, in 1937. So they knew about the first Arab conference in Paris. Many of them actually thought that it expressed their innermost desires for some autonomy as a first step towards independence. And the rest, as you know, is a complicated matter we can discuss some other time.
Yes, of course. So we have another question from Nadia. What do you think Rihani and Gibran would tell us if they were alive in this challenging political moment today? That's a good question about this climate.
There is the Arab Awakening by George Antonius. Thank you, Usam. I think it was Usam. I don't think they'll. Here is the thing. I think they will tell us the same thing. How do I put this? That's the question that kind of sent me in a loop, in a way, because we all heard about the Arab Spring, for example, right? To my mind, as a historian, I think it is like picking up the slack where we left off after World War I. What they were telling us at the time is reform, unite, stay together, you're Arabs, free Syria, all of Syria, which is Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and east of the Jordan River as one country. Yeah. So if they're alive today, they will say, hey, wake up again. So have another Nahda and you still have the same goals. So look at what's happening in Lebanon because of confessional politics, among other things. Look at what's happening in Syria. I mean, our dreams have been in suspension since their original message. So why would that message change? So I think they would say the same things.
Yeah. And she followed up by, she wants to give the perspective. I believe you can read the screen. The young people now are doing some work to reinvigorate the political responsibility of Arabs in the diaspora. So what is the way we engage our elders to actually get on the right path and really mobilize all these forces and political grassroots movements that are happening and sprouting a little bit here and there, of course, with the most recent Lebanese experience in just past October.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget that they were young people themselves once. Ali Abu Mahdi from the relative freedom of Alexandria. As a child, I had the distinct honor of meeting his son, Bab Mahdi, in the New York area, and he actually hand gifted me this first diwan that Ali Abu Mahdi published in Alexandria. And aside from being a reformer and a feminist who wrote in favor of women, he was a nationalist. So, and a young person, and I think, depending on, we couldn't figure out exactly what his birth date was, but he was a child when he published this Diwan Eliya Dahar Abu Mahdi, the first part. Amir Rihani, Gibran, Nasib Arida, as a young man, joined the Free Syria Society. We can follow their example. We can find the most progressive, the most inclusive organization. We have many of them. As long as they are independent, and serve the larger or the greater good of Arab people. And to be honest with you, I mean, most of them turned their eyes to where the need was the greatest. So when colonialism let up around World War II, it yielded, statelets like Syria and Lebanon and Transjordan, which became like Jordan of the eastern bank of the Jordan River. Egypt, distinct from, if you look at the map, you see like straight lines, thanks to Clemenceau and George Lloyd, in Sykes-Picot.
Right.
You know the story. We can challenge all of that and throw our weight behind whoever wants to unify this Arab world, beginning with the Levant, I would say. So again, where the need is the greatest, those countries became countries of their own, except for Palestine. That's a good place to start, I would say.
Right. Well, I just want to thank you once more, Dr. Bawardi, for your wealth of information, and of course, you are such a treasure to this community, and to the University of Michigan community, of course. And I know you can talk about this for days and days and days. So
thank you. I'm sure they agree with you.
remind us again. Remind us again where to find your book, and if you're working on something.
I'll show you. I don't mind plugging my book actually, because you work very hard for those things. On those things, so you can find it straight from the publisher. It's on Amazon, but also the University of Texas Press, and the paperback should be around $20-25. And if you have difficulty, get in touch. I mean, I'm easy to find. So.
Yes. Well, thank you once more, Dr. Bawardi. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much
Jana.
for this wonderful, wonderful talk.